There are already a lot of reviews online about these GPUs. However, I have not seen that many in terms of comparing them. And when they do, it is mostly just gaming in 1080p and sometimes 1440p with DLSS. I have also not seen that many productivity benchmarks where the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB really shine. What else is different about this comparison is that both graphic cards are overclocked and the RTX 4060 Ti is a higher-end AIB model. Before we look at benchmarks, I would like to compare the specifications. The biggest difference would be the memory at 100% better, but overclocking is 53% better. However, if you were to overclock these GPUs to their limits, the 4060 Ti is only about 40% faster. However, the NM process is about 37% more efficient, making the core performance 8% better if it scales well. Memory speed may be higher with the RTX 4060 Ti by 28.57%, but overall memory bandwidth is still 35% slower than the RTX 3070. I have a benchmark where faster VRAM makes a difference. The RTX 4060 runs 25% less wattage for similar performance. Starting with gaming, I would like to see how both of these GPUs will perform at 4K instead of 1080p or 1440p. However, neither of these GPUs are designed to handle 4K native at ultra quality in most modern games. There are some exceptions, but my focus is going to be around high with DLSS or FSR quality, which upscales from around 1440p. Some of these games surprise me in terms of what looks the best at my target frame rates of 60. Starting with a game that is not often benchmarked, Saints Row 2022, we are looking at 4K Ultra plus FSR balance that upscales from around 1080p. I am in the same area near the church. Unfortunately, frame rates are not that great at this settings. As you can see here, my RTX 3070 only floats around 30 FPS average, while my RTX 4060 Ti floats around 50 FPS due to VRAM exceeding 8 GB. That is about 66% better frame rate, yet still below 60 FPS. 1% lows are often in the 20s with the 3070, while the 4060 Ti keeps it in the 40s. Also, FSR balance hurts the quality. So in conclusion, I cannot recommend playing the game in ultra settings. In medium with FSR ultra quality, the RTX 3070 surprisingly is able to keep up with 40 FPS average, even though VRAM is floating around 8.5 gigabytes. However, the 1% lows is another story. I have seen the RTX 3070 1% lows down into the 20s, while I see the RTX 4060 Ti stay around high 30s 1% lows. I am not sure why this performs worse with the RTX 4060 Ti while the RTX 3070 performs better compared to 4K Ultra with FSR balance. Unfortunately, I cannot recommend these settings either. Lastly, medium with FSR performance is the setting I would choose for my RTX 3070 because it keeps VRAM under 8 gigabytes. As you can see, the average is finally over 60 frames per second, but there is still dips into the 50s, while the 1% lows can sometimes dip into the 40s. As for the RTX 4060 Ti, I am able to get around 70 FPS while the 1% lows in the 60s. My RTX 3070 has more cores and faster VRAM, so it is surprising that my RTX 4060 Ti is about 15% faster. It may be because the clock speeds are 2900 MHz instead of the RTX 3070 clocked at 2100 MHz. This is the setting I would recommend for the RTX 3070. For the RTX 4060 Ti, I would recommend high with FSR balanced or performance, or medium with FSR balanced. The Outerworlds Spacer Choice Edition is really heavy on the GPU. I have not seen that many benchmarks of this game. In very high with FSR quality, there is a noticeable difference in frame rates. I am in one of the heavier areas of the game. As you can see here, the RTX 3070 really struggles, only achieving around 30 FPS with the lows into the 20, while the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB remains around 50 FPS with 1% lows into the 40s. I do not recommend this high of setting for either of these GPUs, even though the RTX 4060 Ti is about 66% better, similar gains as St. Roy 2022 Ultra with FSR balance. On a side note, one area I noticed that the 3070 drops down to the 20s averages with the lows down into the 10s. There is really not much to say here about Ultra with FSR balance. The performance is closely the same as very high with FSR quality. The RTX 3070 still dips down into 30 averages with lows into the 20s. However, I did notice that sometimes the average is slightly higher, going into the 40s, while the RTX 3060 Ti never dips into the 40 FPS average. Also, VRAM utilization is slightly more. I would stay away from Ultra in this game, even if you are trying to use FSR performance. Well, this is disappointing. Here is an example of poor game optimization. 4K low, and yet my RTX 3070 only handles 20 FPS with the lows down into the 10s. This is likely due to VRAM exceeding 8 GB, apparently in low. This is why I was playing the game in medium with FSR performance, and even then, frame rates would tank. As for the 4060 Ti, it is able to keep up with the averages in the 70s. That is clearly over a 100% performance gain in this setting. Medium with FSR balance is interesting. Despite VRAM once again exceeding 8 GB, the 3070 is somehow able to keep up, getting an average in the 60s, which is my frame target. But 1% lows aren't that great, as you can see. Usually it is in the 40s, but it will sometimes dip into the 30s. The 4060 Ti is able to reach 80 FPS average, with the 1% lows seem to be around the 70s, but sometimes it may dip into the 60s. This settings is a playable experience, minus the 3070 1% lows dipping into sometimes the 30s. This is more realistic settings you would play the game in. So we already know that the 3070 needs to have it set to about medium with FSR performance, or maybe low with FSR balance. But with the 4060 Ti, you can actually go up to high with FSR quality and still keep it above 60 FPS. Lows sometimes are in the 50s, but that is still better than dealing with what the 3070 is giving, even in lower presets. Godfall high plus FSR quality, the VRAM is over 11 GB, so the 3070 1% lows are expected sometimes in the 30s, making the gameplay experience not as good despite the 71 frames per second average. You may have to turn down graphics even more to keep the VRAM under 8 GB, so the 1% lows do not suffer as much. As for the 4060 Ti, the 1% lows are mostly in the low 70s or high 60s. The average is an outstanding 98 frames per second in this benchmark. You are looking at a 38% better average performance with this game preset, and well, closer to 100% better 1% lows. Ultra with FSR balance was expected in Godfall, except for the VRAM being less than the high plus FSR quality. With the 3070, the average frame rate is down to 43 FPS, while the 1% lows are in the 20s, but sometimes in the teens. As for the 4060 Ti, it is able to keep above 70 FPS. Unfortunately, there is something else we need to discuss. The 1% lows with the 4060 Ti sometimes does dip into the 20s, and this is the only game in my testing where the speed of VRAM matters. 288 gigabits a second memory bandwidth is relatively slow for a GPU having 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Even the RTX 2060 has faster VRAM at 366 gigabytes per second. The oldest game I will be testing is Control. I absolutely love this game. This game was released around the time the RTX 2080 Ti that could only handle 4K Ultra at 30 frames per second. In medium plus DLSS quality, I would say both GPUs is basically a tie, even though about 300 megabytes of VRAM is spilling over. However, if you were to go in more graphically demanding parts of the game, more VRAM is going to spill over and the RTX 3070 frame rates will suffer. This is more of an ideal setting for both GPUs to keep above 60 frames per second. Higher frame rates is especially useful in this game. As for high plus DLSS quality, both of these GPUs seem to be averaging around high 50s and low 60s. However, other areas I have seen the RTX 3070 go into the 40s averages. As for the 1% lows, they are worse with the 3070 dipping into the 40s, while the 1% lows in the RTX 4060 Ti is around 50s. Because of the frame drops, it may be worth turning down settings to the previous medium with DLSS quality, but another option is high with DLSS balance. I found that high with DLSS balance doesn't look as clear, and the frame rates are slightly less, however. In conclusion, the RTX 4060 Ti, when overclocked, is able to handle new games that utilizes less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM around 15% better. But once VRAM exceeds 8 gigabytes, the performance cap is closer to 30%, but in some instances I have seen averages more about 60%. When it comes to older games, it is basically a tie. To add, when I used user benchmark, the RTX 3070 outperformed the 4060 Ti in DirectX 9 by 11%. However, there has not been a game released with DirectX 9 since 2012 with World of Warcraft and Guild Wars. And those older games, you are basically getting high frame rates with both GPUs. The 1% lows is worth examining. There is some games where the 1% lows is closer to 90% better with the RTX 4060 Ti. With Outerworlds Spacer Choice Edition Native Low, the 1% lows was around 200% better. Based on the information provided, if you want to go 4K in modern games, you will need more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, even when playing at medium with DLSS. Imagine you are employed to work for a factory during the industrial era. You have to manage steam-powered equipment while dealing with a boss who is constantly down your throat to manage everything precisely. Here is a soon-to-be-released game called Keep It Running Together, a high-stress job simulator. This game is developed by Evil Turtle Productions, a Dutch video game company. I am currently playing it in 4K high plus FSR 60% or about balanced preset, and as you can see here, it does exceed 8 GB of VRAM. With my RTX 4060 Ti 16 GB, you should be able to play the game just fine in medium with FSR 80% or around FSR Ultra quality to get 60 FPS just fine. When it comes to productivity, I have gotten some interesting results, and there are some instances I didn't quite expect. You will see in some workflows that the 4060 Ti is the only one that will work due to sufficient VRAM, but in other circumstances it actually loses due to the slower memory. Video editing caught me by surprise because rendering is unfortunately slower with the 4060 Ti compared to the 3070 as a result of slower memory in this scenario. However, one contributing factor is that I'm using version 17, whereas version 18 Plus is more optimized for the 4000 series GPUs. Now, it is possible that the 4060 Ti could beat it by 3% on the newer version. What I did not know is that enabling smart access memory does make a significant difference. As you can see, the VRAM usage is higher with the 3070 for some odd reason, maxing it out, while the RTX 4060 Ti is not even close to its max. In other words, the RTX 4060 Ti is about 35% slower, unfortunately. Another test I did was rendering a video I recorded in H.265 4K 48 FPS. I used heavy color grading for this. In this scenario, the 3070 became only 13% faster. However, there is something else I should add. The extra VRAM and AV1 support make the RTX 4060 Ti make a huge difference in video playback. I rarely have to do optimized media now. In Stable Diffusion, there are benchmarks that claim the 3070 is 5% faster than the 4060 Ti due to faster overall memory bandwidth, but they often test it with 512 x 512 with only 30 steps with a model that you can easily keep under 8 GB of VRAM. If we were to do 2048 x 2048 with 150 steps and 222 words, this test tends to bounce around with the results, but at the end shows the 4060 Ti about 5.2% faster. The likely reason for the 10% performance difference is because the 4060 Ti faster clocks could gain about 8% performance. The IPC could offer 3% gains, the L2 cache advantage offering a 3% advantage as well. This is how, on average, the 4060 Ti 16GB was gaining around 15% better performance over the 3070, provided memory bandwidth isn't the bottleneck. Whenever I try to upscale 1080p 3x with LSDR and SCUTNet, that means the image scales to around 6K. I was unsuccessful getting this rendered with the 3070. As you can see, my VRAM usage is over 11 gigabytes. AI cannot allocate to the system RAM. This means in order to render with the 3070, you would only be able to upscale by 2x or possibly 2.5x to keep the VRAM requirements under 8 GB. Wait a minute, only 20 frames per second in Second Life? If you look closely, I intentionally set the CPU clocks to 1.7 GHz. Even though the GPU is close to max out at 99%, the CPU very well could be the bottleneck. So once we get the CPU clock speeds higher, as you can see, our frame rates go clear to 34 frames per second. Yes, from 20% to 34% is a 70% performance difference between 1.7 GHz and around 3.8 GHz. Something I should note, the GPU now becomes the bottleneck because the Ryzen 7 5800X CPU maximum clock speed is actually around 4.9 gigahertz. Apparently I am not achieving that on any of my cores. That means the CPU headroom is 29%. In other words, upgrading to an RTX 4070 Ti would cause this CPU to become a bottleneck at its maximum clocks and only achieving around 43 frames per second. Starting with my photography preset, this isn't really designed for video recording. What I have noticed is that the 4060 Ti is able to keep around 30 to 50 frames per second. The 3070 on the other hand has dips into the 20s, while the 1% lows are often in the teens. Other times it appears to be around 30 frames per second. VRAM isn't the bottleneck here. This is a scenario where the 4060 Ti is somehow 30% faster without VRAM spillage. So chances are the 12% came from more cache, the 8% came from the clocks, not just a 15% architectural gain. Next is the arcade preset. This was originally used to record in a less graphically demanding area. The settings were turned down just enough to where I could achieve 48 frames per second in 4K. As you can see here, the 3070 reached 38 frames per second at one point, but then there are incidences it goes clear down to the single digits for some strange reason. I even see 0 FPS and 1% lows for some reason. While the 4060 Ti can achieve 40 frames per second, but then there are some instances it does dip down into the 20s. Unfortunately, you would have to turn down the shading even further to achieve higher frame rates if you want Second Life to operate in 4K in these demanding areas, or turn down the resolution to 1440p. Personally, I choose to record at 1440p now, so that way I can keep a stable 60 frames per second. You can upscale with FSR reshader or use AI to upscale it in post. In conclusion, the 4060 Ti may be overall better, but being 35% slower when rendering Boris Continuum Complete plugins is a big disappointment, and same goes with 13% slower in rendering in DaVinci Resolve with color grading. The 5% gain in AI isn't that impressive, but at least I can do AI upscale to 6K just fine, while the 3070 did not even work. The 30% performance gain is surprising in Second Life, so the RTX 4000 series makes a big difference, but the CPU single core performance matters as well. Overall, I would say the RTX 4060 Ti is just better for productivity in real-time scenario. It would especially cut time down when editing in DaVinci Resolve due to the 16 gigabytes of VRAM. If you are still having challenges deciding what components you want to include for your PC, you can always go to Affordable Custom PC that can consult with you on what hardware to pick. Deciding between a 3070 for faster VRAM and raw power versus a 4060 Ti 16GB for the extra VRAM can be a hard decision, but at least you are informed which GPU may be better for your needs.